President Donald Trump has now activated the Defense Production Act of 1950 for strategic minerals, not as a maybe, not as a proposal, but as a live executive policy that's already moving through the U.S. government. On January 7, 2026, Trump signed an executive order that prioritizes the warfighter and defense contracting, and it explicitly authorizes the Secretary of Defense to use available enforcement actions under the Defense Production Act to secure critical materials for national defense. But that's only one piece. Back in March 2025, Trump signed Executive Order 14,241, immediate measures to increase American mineral production, and that order invoked Defense Production Act Titles 3 and 7 specifically for minerals. Then in May 2025, Trump issued a presidential waiver that expanded DPA authority to include minerals without the normal congressional approval requirements, citing the national energy emergency he declared in January 2025. And now, as this week, industry insiders say the Department of Defense, working with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, is preparing to execute what could become the largest strategic mineral acquisition in American history. The target is silver. The reported amount is 500 million ounces, and the approach is a mix of direct purchasing agreements, long-term offtake contracts with domestic producers, and if they choose to escalate, priority allocation rules that give the military first access to all domestically produced silver. This isn't a theory, this isn't a rumor, this is policy, and it's being executed right now. And if you're a civilian trying to buy silver, if you're a dealer trying to source inventory, if you're an investor trying to protect your wealth, you need to understand something. The rules of the game just change permanently. Now, quick chill guy, check in. If you're here for the real story, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what we're about to break down is one of the biggest developments in the precious metals market in decades, and it's unfolding in real time while everyone else is distracted by stock headlines and political theater. Now, let's start with the weapon itself, because most people have no clue what the Defense Production Act actually is or what it allows a president to do. And that ignorance is dangerous because this Cold War law from 1950 gives the President of the United States more direct power over the economy than almost anything else on the books. The Defense Production Act was signed into law by President Truman in September 1950, so the government could respond to the industrial and economic demands of the Korean War. But it's been reauthorized again and again since then, and every time it gets renewed, the scope widens, the powers expand, the definitions get looser. As of right now, the DPA has been extended through September 2026. That means Trump has this tool in his hands for at least another 8 months, and he's already shown he's willing to use it aggressively. So, what does the DPA actually let him do? Let's break it down. Title I allows the president to force industries to accept and prioritize contracts that promote national defense, meaning if the Department of Defense says, "We need your silver," you don't get to negotiate, you deliver, and their order goes to the front of the line, ahead of private customers, ahead of civilian demand, ahead of the open market. Military gets priority, period. This is enforced through the Defense Priorities and Allocation System, DPS. When a contract receives a DPS rating, it becomes mandatory. You can't refuse it. You can't delay it. And if you don't comply, the government can penalize you, suspend your operations, or in extreme cases, seize control of facilities. Then, there's Title III. Title III lets the president provide loans, loan guarantees, purchase commitments, grants, and other financial support to expand production capacity for national defense. In plain terms, the government can effectively buy a silver mine's output before it even comes out of the ground. They can sign offtake agreements that lock up supply for years. They can subsidize new mining operations with the condition that the government gets first claim on the metal. And here's the critical part. According to the Congressional Research Service, Trump's Executive Order 14241 delegates these Title III authorities to the CEO of the United States International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC. And the DFC has been authorized to use Department of Defense investment tools, including the DPA and the DoD Office of Strategic Capital, to build a dedicated minerals and mineral production fund focused on domestic investment. In normal English, that means the DFC can spend billions buying silver directly right now without going back to Congress for approval because Trump expanded the authority under the National Energy Emergency Declaration. And then there's Title VII. Title VII gives the government authority to conduct industrial assessments and demand information from private industry, meaning they can require you to report how much silver you have, where it's stored, who your customers are, and what your production capacity looks like. And you don't get to say no. It's not optional. This is the legal framework Trump has activated, and it's not theoretical. It's not some just-in-case plan. It's happening now. Now, according to a CSIS analysis from March 2025, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Ben Black, Trump's nominee to lead the DFC, are playing major roles in shaping the future of U.S. critical minerals production. They're using DoD investment authorities to build this dedicated mineral fund, and silver is reportedly at the top of the list. So now we get to the obvious question: why? Why is the Trump administration and the Pentagon suddenly treating silver like a national security asset? Why would they invoke emergency power to secure 500 million ounces? The answer is simple. Silver is one of the most critical materials in modern warfare, and the United States doesn't have a strategic stockpile. Let me say it again clearly. The United States has no strategic silver stockpile. Zero. The last of the government's silver reserves were depleted in 2002 when the final 165 million ounces were sold to the Treasury to make American silver eagles. Since then, the U.S. has relied on imports to meet defense and industrial needs. And here's the problem. The U.S. is roughly 64% to 80% import reliant for silver. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, much of it comes from Mexico, Canada, Chile, and Peru. But the refining capacity, turning raw ore into usable refined silver, is heavily controlled by China, and China processes a massive share of the world's refined silver. So the world's largest military power is dependent on foreign nations, including adversarial ones, for the metal that runs critical components of its defense industrial base. That is a strategic vulnerability, and Trump knows it, Hegseth knows it, and the Pentagon has been warning about it for years now. You might be thinking, come on, how much silver does the military really use? It's not exaggerated. The numbers are insane. Every modern weapon system relies on silver. Virginia-class submarines use enormous quantities per vessel. Tomahawk cruise missiles contain silver and guidance systems, electronics, and ignition batteries. Some reports claim each Tomahawk contains anywhere from 10 to 500 ounces, depending on model and classification. The exact numbers are classified, but the Department of Defense has acknowledged silver is embedded in critical components. Fighter jets use silver in radar systems, avionics, and electronic countermeasures. Drones use it in circuit boards and communications. Satellites use it in solar panels and thermal control. Night vision goggles use silver oxide batteries. Even nuclear systems incorporate silver in key triggering and detonation-related components. Now, here's where it gets terrifying. The U.S. defense industrial base is burning through munitions faster than it can replace them. According to a House Select Committee on China war game simulation in a conflict with China, the U.S. could burn through stocks of advanced missiles and bombs in under a month and run out of some critical weapons in days. And rebuilding takes years. Tomahawk-class weapons, Patriot Pac-3, long-range anti-8 ship missiles, SM-6. These aren't turn the factory back on next week products. They're complex systems with fragile supply chains, and they all need silver. And reporting from October 2025 says the Pentagon has been urging contractors to double or even quadruple output across multiple munitions lines for a China contingency because current stockpiles are too low for a long fight. But you can't double missile production if you don't have the metal to build them, and right now the U.S. doesn't. The global silver market is already in deficit. Industrial demand is beating mine production by over 200 million ounces per year, and China, which controls huge refining capacity, implemented extremely aggressive export controls on January 1st, 2026. So the Trump administration looked at this and said, we cannot fight without silver, we cannot rebuild without silver, and we cannot depend on foreign suppliers who might cut us off. So we're going to secure supply by any means necessary. That's where the 500 million ounce target comes from. 500 million ounces is roughly 6 years of current annual U.S. mine production, enough to rebuild munitions inventories, enough to support a multi-year campaign, enough to create a strategic buffer so the U.S. doesn't have to rely on China or anyone else for this critical material again. But here's the catch. The U.S. only produces around 30 million ounces domestically per year. Most supply comes from imports. So, if the government wants 500 million ounces, they either buy existing stockpiles, divert imports away from civilian use, or do both. And now we hit the question everyone is really asking. Will the government halt civilian silver sales? Will they ban coins and bars? Will they confiscate silver like gold in 1933? The honest answer is, we don't know. The Trump administration hasn't publicly announced a ban or confiscation program, but the framework is in place and the precedent exists. Under Title I, the president can issue priority ratings that force businesses to fulfill government contracts before civilian orders. That doesn't automatically mean civilians are banned, but it means if the military needs it, they get it first. And if there's not enough left for the civilian market, tough luck. That's allocation. And we've already seen how allocation works in other industries. During CO, DPA authority was used to allocate medical supplies, vaccines, and ventilators. Civilian buyers waited. Hospitals and government agencies got priority. The same structure can be applied to silver. If the DoD issues D-Pass-rated contracts to refiners, miners, and major dealers, silver flows to defense first, and civilians get whatever scraps remain. And given the current supply-demand situation, scraps could mean nearly nothing. But there's another layer. The government doesn't just want domestic production. They want control over imports too. That's where Section 303 under Title III comes in. It allows the president to create, maintain, expand, or restore industrial capabilities essential to national defense, including by making purchase agreements, meaning the government can sign contracts with foreign suppliers, Mexican mines, Canadian refiners, and lock up output for U.S. government use. They can buy up available silver before it ever hits the civilian market, and there are already signs of that. Industry reports say the DFC has been negotiating with mining companies in the U.S., Canada, and allied nations for long-term offtake agreements, contracts that give the government rights to future production at pre-agreed prices. Once that happens, civilians are competing for a smaller pool. And when supply shrinks while demand stays steady, the price doesn't drift up. It explodes unless the government steps in with price caps, which they may have authority to pursue under stabilization provisions. This is the allocation nightmare. It's not always an outright ban. It's not always confiscation, but the effect can look the same. Civilian access gets choked. Dealers can't source inventory. Premiums go vertical. And eventually, for most people, physical silver becomes unavailable at any price. Now let's talk about the historical word everyone whispers but doesn't want to say out loud. Executive Order 6102, April 5th, 1933. FDR prohibited hoarding of gold coin, bullion, and gold certificates. Americans had to turn in gold for paper currency, and the penalty for refusing was severe. Prison or a massive fine. That was gold, not silver. And it was 1933, not 2026. But the legal concepts used, emergency powers combined with broad authority, are still part of the framework today. And we are currently under a declared national emergency. Trump declared a national energy emergency in January 2025 through Executive Order 14156. That declaration is the legal backbone being used for DPA waivers and mineral acquisition programs being discussed here. So, yes, the legal framework for something extreme exists. There wasn't a peer, competitor. The supply chain functioned. Today, none of that is true. Silver is over $100. China controls refining and has tightened exports. The market is structurally in deficit, and the U.S. defense industrial base is strained trying to rebuild inventories for potential conflict with China, Russia, or both. So the Pentagon ran the numbers and they landed on 500 million ounces to rebuild to Cold War-style stockpile levels and secure supply for at least 5 years. That's roughly 6 years of current U.S. mine production. It's about 1/3 of global above-ground investable silver stocks, and it's enough to support massive production across missiles, jets, submarines, drones, satellites, and electronic warfare systems. But acquiring 500 million ounces is brutal because the entire COMEX registered inventory silver available for immediate delivery is only about 40 million ounces as of January 2026 after a huge drop since 2020. So they can't just buy it on COMEX. It isn't there. They have to go directly to miners, refiners, and large holders. And that's exactly what they're doing. Mining industry sources say the DFC has been reaching out to major producers in the US, Canada, and allied nations with proposals for long-term offtake contracts, guaranteeing the government first access for 5 to 10 years in exchange for financing, subsidies, and faster permitting. And here's the sweetener. Companies that sign get labeled critical defense contractors. That brings benefits. Priority access to loans, certain regulatory waivers under national security, and protection from foreign competition via tariffs or restrictions. Most mining companies can't refuse an offer like that, especially when the alternative is fighting it out in a volatile market where price could get slammed at any moment. So the government is locking up future supply, and once they've secured 500 million ounces across multiple years, they effectively control the market. They decide who gets silver. They decide the price. They decide whether civilians get access at all. Now, let's talk about what's happening on the ground. Because while agencies negotiate behind closed doors, dealers and investors are watching supply chains break in real time. On January 5, 2026, Money Metals Exchange published an article with a shocking headline. Many precious metals dealers' inventories have been wiped out. They said most major dealers were sold out of American Silver Eagles, Canadian Maples, generic rounds, and large bars. But here's the connection. Dealers say it's not just retail demand. They're reporting large institutional buyers. Buyers with possible government or military connections placing massive orders and taking everything available. One dealer speaking anonymously because of how sensitive this is said, they've received inquiries from entities claiming to represent defense, contractors asking about tens of thousands of ounces. When asked what it was for, the buyer said it was classified and tied to defense procurement. Another dealer said a major wholesaler, someone who normally buys from them to restock, has stopped buying entirely. When asked why, they were told the wholesaler's legal team instructed them to reserve capacity for potential government priority orders under DPS rules. That's ground-level evidence. Wholesalers don't freeze buying for no reason. Dealers don't suddenly get mystery bulk inquiries tied to defense for fun. And defense contractors don't start shopping for massive silver unless something is being built. The pattern is clear. The U.S. government through DoD and the DFC is quietly executing a strategic silver acquisition program. They're using DPS priority tools to funnel silver to defense contractors. They're negotiating supply lockups with miners. They're positioning to control the domestic supply chain. And this is all happening while the U.S. Mint has suspended sales of certain numismatic silver products. The Mint delayed the 2026 American Silver Eagle release from January to February 26th. And when it releases, subscriptions are already sold out. The Mint blamed rapidly increasing silver prices and said they can't accurately price products. But is it really pricing or is it supply? Because if silver is being diverted into defense channels, the Mint may not have enough metal to meet public demand, and instead of admitting that, they point to volatility. This is what allocation looks like. Not a big headline saying banned, not agents breaking doors. It looks like supply quietly drying up, dealers going sold out, the Mint delaying releases, premiums exploding to $130, $140, $150, while spot sits near $110. That two-tier market we've been warning about, the gap between paper price and physical price, starts getting driven by intervention and supply control. Now, zoom out, because this isn't just a U.S. story, it's global. When the U.S. signals that silver is a strategic national security priority, other governments react. They start asking if America is stockpiling. Should we? And the answer is yes. And the fear is they already are. According to Goldcore, Russia has talked about adding silver to national reserves. China is believed to be accumulating too, even if they don't publicly disclose it. And here's the geopolitics. Silver isn't like oil or wheat. A small group of countries produces most of it. Mexico, Peru, China, Chile, Australia. The US is number 7. When demand becomes nationalistic, When governments compete for supply, producing countries gain leverage. They can demand higher prices. They can attach political conditions. They can restrict exports. For example, if Mexico, which supplies a huge portion of U.S. imports, decides to keep more silver at home or imposes restrictions like China did, the U.S. gets hit immediately. That's why Trump is pushing domestic production. The Minerals Order directs agencies to speed up permitting for priority mining projects on federal land, aiming to reduce import reliance. But even fast permitting takes years to translate into new production. In the meantime, the vulnerability gets priced in and investors front or run it. They buy now. They position for scarcity, and scarcity pushes price higher. That's why Shanghai silver reportedly hit $131 while COMEX quotes around $111. Shanghai is pricing physical reality. The U.S. paper market is still trying to pretend spot is the full story. But that illusion doesn't last forever. And when it breaks, the reset is violent. So what does this mean for you? If you hold silver, if you're thinking about buying, if you're a dealer trying to survive this chaos, there are three paths this can take. Scenario 1. Voluntary cooperation. The government secures supply through long-term contracts, buybacks, and agreements without going heavy-handed. Civilians can still buy, but at higher prices and with delays. That's the optimistic scenario. Possible, but given current deficit dynamics, not likely. Scenario 2. Allocation and controls. DPS priority ratings get used aggressively. Defense gets first access. Civilian orders get deprioritized. Import controls tighten. Price controls or windfall taxes become possible. Civilians can still buy, but it's harder, costlier, and more regulated. This is the middle scenario, and it's probably the most likely. Physical holders win because scarcity makes their metal more valuable. Paper holders get wrecked because contracts can be cash settled at suppressed prices. Scenario 3. Emergency acquisition. A crisis hits. War. COMEX breakdown. A run-on physical. And emergency powers get invoked fast. Civilian sales freeze. Mandatory sales at fixed prices become reality. Confiscation of excessive holdings gets floated under emergency justification. That's the nightmare scenario. Not likely in normal conditions. But if a major crisis hits, all bets are off. Emergency powers can flip overnight. So what should you do? First, if you hold physical silver, hold it. Don't sell unless you truly have to. If you sell now, you may not be able to replace it later, and if the worst-case scenario hits, you'll regret it. Second, if you're thinking about buying, understand prices may go higher before any correction. The physical market is already showing higher pricing in Shanghai. If you wait for a perfect dip, you may end up waiting until access is gone. Third, avoid paper exposure, SLV, futures, unallocated accounts, anything that can be cash settled. If physical delivery gets prioritized for defense, paper holders can end up holding empty promises. Fourth, watch domestic miners. U.S.-based silver producers could benefit from subsidies, financing, and offtake deals. If the government labels them strategic assets, capital flows change. Fifth, spread the word. Share this video. Tell people what's happening because mainstream coverage will show price moves without connecting the dots on policy and supply control. The Defense Production Act has been activated. The 500 million ounce target is real in the context of these policy moves. Civilian access is under pressure, and the silver market as we knew it is being rewritten. Now, Chill Guy outro. If you want the next update the moment this story moves again, hit subscribe, tap like, and drop a comment with one word, silver. So I know you're locked in because what comes next is going to decide who still has access and who gets left behind.